Hello everyone and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to take a pretty fascinating journey straight into the chaotic, deeply turbulent origins of sociological theory. We're going to dive into how some of history's absolute greatest thinkers tried to make sense of a world that was, literally, completely rewriting itself right before their very eyes.
So I want you to just imagine for a second that you're living right through the intense, massive upheavals of the French and Industrial Revolutions. Everything you know about how the world works, your job, your government, your local community, it's all being ripped apart and transformed. The stakes were incredibly high, and people were desperately searching for answers. And that urgent, burning need to understand what was happening, that's exactly why the field of sociology was born in the first place.
All right, let's look at our roadmap for today. First, the birth of social theory. Second, Comte and Durkheim's order. Third, Marx's radical economic critique. Fourth, Weber's multifaceted society. And finally, number 5, Spencer and British evolutionism.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the birth of social theory.
Before we really get into the specific thinkers, we need to set up a foundational lens. You see, sociological theory is never just created in a vacuum. It's actually a dynamic interplay between what we call the inner context, which is the specific personal mindset of the theorist, and the outer context, the broader social and political environment happening all around them. So, social theory is quite literally a deeply personal reaction to real-world chaos.
And to truly grasp that outer context, you just have to look at the massive disruptions of the era. You had the French Revolution in 1789, which brought sweeping, monumental changes, but also a really severe breakdown of basic law and order. Some critics actually argued things were worse than back in the Middle Ages. Then you had the Industrial Revolution, which forced a massive shift from traditional, farm-based economies straight into urban factory systems under laissez-faire capitalism. People were flooding into cities, and they were facing things like pollution, severe overcrowding, and just extreme wealth disparities. You had factory owners making massive profits, while the workers were earning painfully low wages. And naturally, this glaring inequality sparked the rise of socialism. All of these massive, earth-shattering changes created a super urgent need for intellectuals to figure out how society actually functions.
Moving on to Section 2, Comte and Durkheim's order.
So, over in France, the intellectual response was heavily focused on trying to restore social stability. Early French sociology was born directly out of a fierce philosophical tug-of-war. On one side, you've got the Enlightenment. These were thinkers championing the individual, progressive ideology, science, and social change. But then, on the flip side, you have the counter-Enlightenment. These thinkers, like du Bonald, were actually terrified of this disruptive change. They wanted to focus on the collectivity. They were actually advocating for a return to medieval harmony, patriarchy, and even the monarchy. So those early sociologists were really forced to navigate the intense tension between these two completely opposing worldviews.
Which brings us to Auguste Comte, the guy who actually coined the term sociology. Reacting directly to all that revolutionary anarchy, Comte set out to build what he called a rigorous social physics. He proposed this evolutionary law of 3 stages. First, a theological stage that relied entirely on the supernatural. After that, a metaphysical stage relying on nature. And then finally, a positivistic stage which relied strictly on science. For Comte, it was only when those earlier, unscientific stages were completely eliminated that the social anarchy would end and true order would finally prevail.
Later in the 19th century, Émile Durkheim totally took up this mantle from Comte. Durkheim was also deeply concerned with social order. In his very famous 1893 work, The Division of Labor in Society, he posed a great question. What is the actual binding glue of society? Well, he theorized that early societies were held together by a really strong moral basis, which he called a collective conscience. But as societies become modern and advanced, that collective conscience naturally weakens. So instead, we end up being held together by a highly complex division of labor. Basically, we literally have to rely on each other's specialized skills just to survive.
Next up is Section 3, Marx's radical economic critique.
Now, while the French were obsessing over order, the German thinkers were intensely preoccupied with economics and power. Karl Marx brought a highly polemical, politically activist approach to sociology. His core central concept was economic determinism, and this is a unicausal theory, meaning Marx believed that absolutely every single aspect of society, our laws, our culture, our ideas, is propelled forward purely by material and economic factors. Looking around at the industrial factories of his time, Marx argued that capitalism inherently relied on the exploitation of the laborer. In his view, surplus value, or capitalist profit, was extracted directly at the expense of the wage earners.
But Marx didn't just want to study capitalism, right? His ideology explicitly called for its destruction. He believed capitalism inherently creates extreme exploitation, which then leads to a really severe polarization between the haves and have-nots. This mounting tension, he argued, would inevitably result in a violent, bloody revolution where the working class would rise up to seize the factories, and that would ultimately give way to a new era of community ownership. For Marx, this radical overthrow was simply the only real solution to the harsh realities of that industrial outer context.
Let's move to Section 4, Weber's Multifaceted Society.
So another absolute giant of German sociology, Max Weber, actually formulated his theories specifically to be a counterpoint to Marx's radicalism. While Marx believed in a unicausal economic determinism where the material economy dictates all ideas, Weber stepped in and proposed a multicausal approach. Weber argued essentially that you just can't boil society down to one single factor. Multiple causes are always operating simultaneously. In fact, Weber famously flipped Marx's logic completely upside down. In his famous study of Protestantism, Weber demonstrated that ideas and religious beliefs could actually be the primary engine generating economic development, rather than just the other way around.
Weber was also incredibly interested in something he called formal rationality. He really wanted to understand how social actors make goal-oriented decisions. And what he observed was that in the modern world, these decisions are increasingly enveloped by massive, sprawling systems of bureaucratization. For Weber, modern society was ultimately defined by these giant, rule-bound structures that dictate and guide human behavior. To further explain things, Weber categorized the political structures that emerge in society into three distinct types of authority. First, you have traditional authority, which rests on the sanctity of historical belief patterns. Think of a monarchy, where a prince succeeds a king. Second, there's charismatic authority, which is driven by a leader's extraordinary personal qualities and the devotion of their followers. And finally, rational legal authority. This is the hallmark of the modern state, where leadership is based on formal, legal procedures, like electing a president. Ultimately, Weber's highly formal, academic, and multi-layered approach was really embraced by many Western sociologists. They saw it as a much more reassuring, conservative alternative to Marx's violent revolutionary ideas.
And finally, Section 5, Spencer and British Evolutionism. Now, if we cross the English Channel, British sociologists were actually having a completely different reaction to their own industrial environment. Their approach was super unique because it focused heavily on the individual rather than the collective society. Heavily influenced by Adam Smith's political economy, they really trusted the invisible hand of the market to just naturally create order. And what's truly fascinating here is the paradox. You see, British sociologists were very close to their government, and they deeply respected their overarching institutions. So because they wanted to ward off the specter of Marxian socialism, they completely refused to blame poverty on systemic flaws. Instead, they blamed those systemic problems entirely on individual behavior. They'd attribute poverty to things like personal ignorance, crime, or alcoholism.
The most prominent figure to emerge from this specific British context was Herbert Spencer. Spencer was a social Darwinist. He quite literally compared social institutions to plants and animals. He believed in a strict laissez-faire approach where the state basically should not interfere in the market or try to enact social reforms. Instead, he argued that society progresses perfectly naturally through the survival of the fittest, organically adapting to its environment all on its own. He literally saw society as a giant living organism, where every single part has a specific function in keeping the whole thing alive. To map this out, Spencer charted a very specific evolutionary schema. First, he noted that societies grow in size simply by amalgamating together. Early on, they form what he called militant societies. These are organized primarily for defense and violent aggression, which is what drives their initial growth. But eventually, Spencer argued, a society makes a massive quantum leap into becoming an industrial society. These are highly specialized, peaceful, interactive societies where warfare is actually seen as dysfunctional. In this highly advanced stage, the state just steps back and merely acts as a monitor to keep basic law and order. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we have to return to our foundational framework. Every single one of these theories we've looked at today, from Comte's three stages, to Marx's radicalism, to Weber's bureaucracy, to Spencer's evolution, was a clear-headed response by an individual to the specific, chaotic upheavals of their time. Social theory is fundamentally a reflection of the social environment. It's this continuous feed-forward and feedback loop between the outer context of an era and the inner context of the theorist's own mind.
Which, of course, leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. Today, our own outer context is transforming faster than ever before. We're dealing with artificial intelligence, massive global digital connectivity, you name it. The world is turning upside down all over again. So, as we live through our very own historical upheaval, what new social theories are being written right now? And how do you think future generations will analyze the inner context of today's thinkers? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the world around you.